So today we're going to be visiting the Sedgwick Museum of Earth Sciences. It's a geology museum at the University of Cambridge. It's actually the oldest of the 8 museums which the University of Cambridge Museums Consortium runs. It actually was on the collection of Dr. John Woodward. He collected and catalogued 10,000 specimens, and they were displayed in walnut cases. And 2 of those were left to the university when he died. And then the university purchased another 2, and then a 5th one was added in the 1840s. And that's actually still there on display. Alan Sedgwick, who the museum's named after, expanded the collection and purchased a lot of skeletons from Mary Anning, who we'll have to cover Mary Anning in future video. Very interesting lady who was really instrumental in the origins of the study of dinosaurs. Now, if you're at all interested in fossils, rocks and minerals, this is the museum to get excited about. If you think that's boring, may not be the museum for you. So I have to confess that when I was a child I actually collected rocks, so I thoroughly enjoyed this museum. It is a very detailed collection, and the first room when you enter, down the centre are some interesting fossils like T-Rex head and pieces of, well, there's a full giant sloth, but actually it's all along the sides. It's by the type of stone that it's in. So you have like London clays, Devonian clays, and then within that it's split by the actual era. So this is, here you go, London clay. You have various mollusks and crustaceans and different shells and some very good examples of fossils, and we're talking dozens in every case. Every shelf has between 5 and 50 very good examples of fossils. And as you stroll round, you can see, here's Thanet. So Thanet's the Isle of Thanet, basically out by Margate and Broadstairs. It used to be a separate island, but it silted over during the sort of Viking era. And then you have London clay, which is a bit further in. Now, Thanet clay might not mean you're actually in Thanet, and London clay goes a lot further out than London, but it gives you a sort of broad idea of the area. Here you can see when it used to be sea. You've got some sharks' teeth back there. You've got a bunch of different shells and fairly, let's say, lower life forms. But then you also have some very good examples of fish and lizards and all sorts. I mean, look at that beautiful example of a fossilized fish head, and there, lovely fossils of fish. And yes, I did collect fossils when I was a teenager. So these are examples from around the world. There is very much a British lean to it, that the samples were collected here, but it's been expanded quite substantially. And as with all my museum visits, I try not to film every item in the museum, but to give you a feel for what you're going to see. Also, I appreciate that not everyone's as excited by rocks as possibly I am, so I will skirt through some of these. Interesting display in the centre about learning to become a paleontologist and geologist, and some examples of real world people who actually study these disciplines. And again, more shells, different eras, different types of material or earth that they've been found in. Each one is slightly different, and not a lot of duplicates, but horses, so beautiful example of early horses. And yes, it's just, you know, a random bone. It can be fairly hard to tell, but some of the examples give even a cursory observer a view of just how much animals have evolved over time. And then there's American examples and Right, is that West Africa? There's certainly very large collection around. Beautiful collection here of fossilized plants. So you really can spend quite a long time looking at these. I mean, I'm skirting through them quite swiftly and I have edited them, but they're certainly... This display cabinet I enjoyed is elephants and their relatives, so elephants, rhinoceroses and their ancestors, and it's a substantial collection of different heads and teeth, and you can see how they have the grinding teeth that push out over time the same way as elephants do today, and one of the spine bones. Really beautiful collection. Just round the corner, still really in the first room, there's a large skeleton of a hippopotamus. They look a bit more scary without the skin on. They kind of look like a fat cow when you see them, but not so cuddly. Again, a lot of collection of tusks and teeth and jaws and a little bit of everything in here. The rock collection here actually reminds me a bit of 1990s. There used to be the Museum of Geology in London. It was attached at the hip. It was a separate entrance fee, a separate guidebook, but it was built on the side of the Natural History Museum, the same way that the National Portrait Gallery is kind of built onto the side of they abut each other, the National Gallery. But as you come round here, it's a very comprehensive collection of geology. And there's an exhibit here of Darwin. This is Darwin's cabin, although it does look somewhat different to the exact same cabin replicated in Down House. If you have the opportunity outside of London, you're interested in Charles Darwin, probably the best place to go to really find out about his work, his travels, his collections is Down House. But part of the way he paid for that, apart from Josiah Wedgwood, his grandfather, funding him very heavily when he went on the Beagle, and in fact for much of his work, and for a bit more on that, watch my video on the Wedgwood V&A collection, but also he sold specimens of rocks and fossils to Sedgwick Museum. So they have a very good collection of Darwin's, particularly rocks, but also a few fossils that he collected on his way. And today every school child can tell you that Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. But actually his other major contribution was his voyage on the Beagle, where he travelled around much of the world, and doing that he formulated his concepts and began to kind of work on his ideas for the origin of the species, but also he collected an immense amount of samples of birds, animals, bones, drawings, sketches, very detailed diagrams, notes. And this was in an era where the sciences were still a bit less distinct. You could be maybe not a specialist in, but you could be a botanist, a zoologist and a geologist and have a decent passable academic knowledge of all of them. And effectively it was that blend of all of those that allowed him to undertake the work that he did. And here's some interesting Pliocene. You see there, they're teeth from sharks or large fish. That's red crag, which I must confess I should have looked up where red crag comes from. I've no idea. But very, very broad collection here in terms of the stones and fossils. And really, I'm probably showing you about half of the cabinets, or some of them just fairly swiftly. And between all these cabinets, there's quite good displays explaining things, and there's various art installations, like you might have seen the origami birds back there. And then some examples of minerals and arts, and there's a display here of some sixth form students who were brought into the museum and asked what they'd like to do with rocks in terms of a project, and they've come up with mineral based flags of all the different sexualities. So very much keying into the modern age, as well as reaching back to Darwin's era. And more fossils, more fossils. If you like fossils, you'll be very happy here. If you think they're boring, then possibly you should visit one of the neighbouring museums. And it's actually right next door to the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Here's a predecessor of the, or an ancestor of the elephant. I certainly enjoyed this museum, but the museum next door is really good. I've been there before. Unfortunately, it was closed the day I went. It wasn't on their website closed, but when I turned up, I think it was used for filming that day. So unfortunately, we weren't able to visit. But here, even if it's a bit of a blur, you see the sheer scale of the collection. And while some of these might appear to many to be fairly insignificant little shell or piece of this flesh of a dinosaur, it's from these that we come to understand both how those animals have evolved, but also, like for example, with the skin of dinosaurs, which has been preserved as a fossil, we get to understand what the skin looked like when normally you just see the bone structure, and then the bones are interpreted as how they would have hung together as an animal. Very good collection of fish here, actually, the fossil fishes. I don't think I've seen quite such a detailed one on the fishes, and I don't think I've ever seen so many fossilized shells of different types from different eras in a museum. That tiny booth in the middle is actually the museum shop, and it is very small, but there's some good things in there. And as you go around the rest of it, we're still actually in the first room. It's just it opens up in both directions as you come up the stairs. And here, probably more recognisable to people, the sort of fossil shells that people think of when they look for a fossil at the seashore, or they go into a shop that sells fossils. But there's a lot of, there were some odd sort of worms and very different forms of shell I saw, which looked a lot more stretched out, and definitely an evolution from the sort of standard ones that you see. A lot of people know what an ammonite is, but there were forms of ammonite and nautilus here which were very different shape to how I would expect a nautilus or a ammonite to appear. And then various cores and plates from different slates. You see, the reason they're on plates like that is effectively it's slate. So slate is in layers, and you can nap it. You can tap it on the side with a strong object like a rock hammer, and it will split it into plates like a slate on a roof. Here, these were lovely. They're actually the skin of a fish. You get the bones, but it's very rare that you get to see the scales. And here, a large collection of various bones from the back of I mean, you can see the blades, they're almost like shoulder blades. And the spine. And again, like I said earlier, a lot of context. So they explain both the origin, the meaning, the significance, and they pick out some of the things that you wouldn't get from just looking at the fossil. And it's certainly interesting. And they're Dogger. So Dogger is known today from the weather reports you get Dogger Bank. But in the North Sea, when in the last ice age the water level was a lot lower, there was a landmass called Doggerland. And actually most of ancient Britain at that era wasn't very hospitable and was fairly empty. And people migrated there from Doggerland as Doggerland was eaten up by the North Sea as the sea rose. So those have actually been generally trawled from the bottom. So when they're fishing, they bring up some specimens, and there has been some diving. But it's fairly deep, not hugely, but there is an entire world of fossils of animals and fish and plants down there. Certainly the best example I've seen from Doggerland. Again, a lot of ammonites. And then there's actually a display here that explains the difference between the different types of shell and the families of fossil shells that you commonly see. Some of which, like mollusks, they look very much like their modern day relatives, whereas some of them, like ammonites, I don't believe is a direct descendant, where you'd see it today and say that's an ammonite. Some interesting ichthyosaurs here, and there's one just there displayed at the bottom, which I'll hopefully capture in a second, which was actually from Mary Anning. And it's a good example because when you go to the Natural History Museum and you see the plesiosaurs on the wall, when you're going down the corridor from the main hall where they have a giant sloth at the end, those plesiosaurs are mainly from Lyme Regis and from the Dorset area. But there was a big scandal because they were sold to the Natural History Museum as being the best examples in the world, but there was a parliamentary inquiry because it came out that they'd been quite substantially doctored and filled in, and they hadn't really been as complete as they were presented to the Natural History Museum. So these plesiosaurs in some way I actually prefer, because although there's less of them and they're maybe slightly less impressive, it's a direct link back to Mary Anning, who really was one of the originators of paleontology. And you may have caught on the wall there what looked like a giant millipede in red. That really was a giant millipede. There's a large fossil of it, but you can also see just how big it was. And this, it wasn't a spider, but it's an example of, it looks a bit like a spider, of a very large insect. And plants, beautiful examples of fossilized ferns, and they were much bigger back then than the ferns you might see in a forest today. And very good examples of tree trunks, and you can see the earlier forms of tree. It's a Devonian fish. Devonian's an era. It is linked to Devon, but only in terms of the stone. So there were stones that were found in Devon that were linked to the Devonian period, because that's where they captured those fossils. And again, more and more and more shells and fossils. It's quite an overwhelming collection. A little bit like the Petrie Museum's collection of Egyptology and Sudanese archaeology, where you see thousands of pot shards and vases and some interesting little models here. At the end of the museum, after you've gone through the fossils, you come through to this mineral section, which has a really excellent selection of precious stones, minerals, geodes, quartzes, different types of stone. It's all very clearly labelled, beautiful collection. Certainly bigger than the collection I had as a teenager and a lot more interesting, but I did have a few of these. Not that one on the wall, that's Blue John. You can only find it in the Blue John cave in Derbyshire, and it's a mixture of white and blue quartzite stone, often used for vases and tabletops, and quite precious today, but was always valued for its colour. And there's an example over there as well. There, that cup, which I shot past far too quickly. And that one's fascinating. It really looks like a fungus on the wall in a cave. Examples of tables made out of different minerals. And there is an explanation of the structure, the molecular structure, and also there it's explaining crystals which are double diffusive, so they bend the light more than once. It definitely looks better when you see it in real life. When you photograph through a cabinet, it's never quite the same. You can see the different types of crystal, sort of nodular, those sort of polygons that stick out. I'm sure I should be using the proper technical terms. And also the flakes. We're drawing towards the end of our visit to the museum, and I would say it's a very good museum to visit if you have any interest in dinosaurs, fossils, stones, minerals, and just geology as a whole. Certainly you can choose how long you spend here. You could easily spend half an hour and go through most of the museum. It's only really 3 rooms, but it is a large collection. It's very detailed, and most of those drawers at the side, which I haven't looked in a single one during this visit, have yet more samples. So really it is an amazing resource for the university. And if you're studying, say, A-level or GCSE geography and you're interested in geology, a must visit, I'd say, if you're in the area. And if you are in Cambridge, there's 5 museums we're visiting in Cambridge today. So they'll be coming up in the next couple of weeks, or some Fitzwilliam's probably already out before I release this. And please subscribe to see more of these museum guides. As we make our way back out to the door, I'll just catch a few more of the cabinets to give you a feel for it. It's a very large collection, which I certainly really enjoyed. If you're also interested in paleontology and zoology, then really on the way out of here, just round the corner, if you come out, turn left, and it's the second right, is the Zoology Museum, which is an excellent museum of modern zoology.